He didn't knock. He never knocked in his own house. Seo Ji-hwan pushed open the front door of the Upper East Side townhouse at 8:30 on a Thursday night, and he was not alone. The woman behind him was wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent. She smiled at Imani the way people smile when they already know they've won something slow, almost sympathetic, with just enough warmth to make the knife go deeper. Ji-hwan said, "This is Yuna, business associate. She'll join us for dinner." He said it the way you announce a weather change. Casual. Final. Already decided. Imani stood in her own kitchen, in the home she had made beautiful for years, holding a wooden spoon and looking at the woman her husband had brought to their table. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She smiled back and said, "Of course." The wine is on the counter. If you've ever had to hold yourself completely still while something inside you was breaking, you already know exactly what this night cost her. Stay with this story. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The dinner had been Imani's idea, not the guest. Never the guest. But the dinner itself, the slow braised short ribs that had been in the oven since 4 in the afternoon, the good wine she'd pulled from the rack because she'd wanted the evening to feel like something other of them sitting across from each other in silence the way they had for the past several months. She'd had this fragile, stubborn idea that maybe a nice meal could do something. Not fix anything. She wasn't naive enough to believe in that anymore. But maybe soften the edges of whatever they had become. Maybe remind them both that they'd once been people who chose each other. That was the version of Thursday evening that had existed in Imani Zaire Whitfield's head at 4 o'clock. By 8:30, that version was gone. She stood at the kitchen island with the wooden spoon still in her hand, and she looked at the woman in the red dress, and she made herself breathe, once, slowly, all the way down. Yuna Kwan was beautiful. That was the first thing. The kind of beautiful that requires maintenance and money, and the confidence to walk into another woman's home like the square footage already Buxnamins belongs to you. She was maybe 32, high cheekbones, glossy black hair, a smile that she'd clearly used many times before in exactly this kind of situation. The second thing Imani noticed was Ji-hwan's hand. It was at Yuna's lower back for exactly 4 seconds. Long enough for him to guide her through the door. Long enough for the touch to look natural. Long enough for Imani to understand that this was not the first time that hand had rested there. Ji-hwan was 43 years old, and she had never once seen him touch a business associate like that. He didn't touch people casually. He didn't touch anyone casually. It wasn't who he was. Physical warmth was not in his register. Except apparently it was. Just not with her. "Short ribs smell good," he said, moving to the cabinet for glasses. He said it the way you'd say it if you'd come home alone. Like there was nothing unusual about any of this. Like Imani was simply part of the sceneries of his evening, background noise, behind the more important thing he'd brought through the door. "Almost ready," Imani said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that later. In the way you're proud of surviving something, you had no idea you had the strength to survive. Yuna offered to help set the table. Imani said yes. Because, what else do you say? No, don't touch my plates. Don't stand in my kitchen. Don't smile at my husband with your mouth closed like that. Like you're keeping a secret warm? You can't say those things. Not if you're Imani. Not if you've spent 14 years learning how to be exactly as composed as the man you married expected his wife to be. So Yuna set the table, and Imani finished the short ribs, and Ji-hwan poured 3 glasses of the good wine, and they all sat down together. It was the longest dinner of Imani's life. Not because anyone was cruel. That would have been easier in a way. Cruelty she knew how to answer. What happened instead was worse. Ji-hwan talked mostly to Yuna about a shipping contract in Hamburg. Yuna listened with the kind of focused attention that isn't learned, it's earned, slowly, in private. She laughed at the right moments. She knew the names of his people in Germany. She asked a follow-up question that told Imani she'd been in at least one meeting. Ji-hwan had never mentioned coming home. Imani ate her short ribs and drank her wine and asked one polite question about Hamburg herself. Ji-hwan answered her the way you answer someone who interrupted you. After dinner, Yuna helped clear the plates, she insisted, warmly, graciously, and then Ji-hwan called a car for her and walked her to the door. Imani stayed at the table and listened to the low murmur of their voices in the hallway. She couldn't make out words. She didn't try. When Ji-hwan came back in, he looked almost relaxed. "You handled that well," he said. It was meant as a compliment. Imani looked at him for a moment. Really looked. At the handsome, careful face she'd fallen in love with in her early 30s. At the man who had built an empire and never once asked her what she was doing with her evenings. "I know," she said. She excused herself, went upstairs and locked the bathroom door. She turned on the faucet so he wouldn't hear anything. Then she sat down on the cold tile floor and put her back against the side of the bathtub, and she cried completely, with her hand pressed over her mouth for almost 20 minutes. Not because of Yuna. She would figure that out later, slowly, over the weeks that followed. The crying wasn't really about the woman in the red dress. It was about the 4 seconds of a hand at a lower back. It was about recognizing, at 39 years old, sitting on a bathroom floor in a $12,000 a month townhouse, that she had become invisible inside her own marriage, and she had let it happen so gradually she'd barely noticed it going. She had been a research scientist once. That was the thing. That was the thing she kept coming back to as she pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through it. She had been a brilliant one. Imani Whitfield had finished her doctorate at 31, with a specialty in pharmaceutical chemistry that made her advisor describe her, not casually, in actual print, in the acknowledgments of his textbook, as one of the sharpest analytical minds I have encountered in 30 years of teaching. She had 2 published papers before she was 33. She had a 3rd one in progress the year she met Seo Ji-hwan at a charity event for a Manhattan Children's Hospital. He had been magnetic. That was the only word for it. Not charming, exactly charming implied performance, and Ji-hwan never performed. He simply occupied space differently than other people. Quiet and certain, like a fact of nature. He'd asked her what she worked on, and then actually listened to the answer, which was rarer than it should have been at those kinds of events. She'd been flattered, and then fascinated, and then within 14 months, married. They had moved 4 times in 6 years, following Sirion Global Logistics Expansion Seoul to London, London to Singapore, Singapore to New York. Each time, Imani had negotiated her own situation. Research positions that fit around the geography. Laboratories she could access on her schedule. She'd told herself she was making reasonable compromises. That's what marriage required, wasn't it? Both people adjusting, taking turns? Except it hadn't been both people. It had been her. She was the one adjusting, every time. And Ji-hwan, she saw this now with a clarity that felt like something cracking open in her chest. Ji-hwan had come to expect it. Had stopped asking if the position was good, if the lab was adequate, if she was happy. He'd started saying, "You'll sort it out," in the same tone he used when he delegated logistics to his assistants. When they moved to New York and she took the position in New Jersey, a quieter role than she deserved, support research rather than lead, a 40-minute commute, each way he'd said she'd sort it out. She had. She'd sorted it out for 14 months. And during those 14 months in the locked study on the 3rd floor of the townhouse that Ji-hwan had never once pushed open the door of, she had been building something that belonged entirely to her. It had started almost accidentally. She'd been going through old research files. One evening a night, Ji-hwan said he'd be home at 9 and wasn't home until past midnight without calling, which had happened so often by then that she'd stopped tracking it consciously. She'd pulled up notes from her doctoral work. A synthesis pathway she'd sketched out in 2011 and then abandoned when the funding for that branch of research had dried up. She hadn't thought about it in years, but sitting alone in the study, half a glass of wine in her hand, she'd looked at those old notes with new eyes. And she'd seen it. The thing she'd missed at 28. The thing she'd been too deep inside to see when she was generating the data herself. A modification to the core compound pathway that, theoretically, would address the stability problem that had always made the original approach impractical. She had stayed up until 3 in the morning, running preliminary calculations. She had called Dr. Nadine Baptiste the next morning before breakfast. Nadine was 51, Haitian-American, and one of the only people in the field who could follow Imani's work fast enough to actually challenge it rather than simply nod along. They'd overlapped briefly at a research institute in New Haven and had kept in loose contact ever since, the kind of professional friendship that lives mostly in emails but becomes real fast when you actually need it. "Walk me through it again," Nadine had said, after Imani's first explanation. Imani walked her through it again. There was a long pause. "Imani, I know, this would change the whole thing. You need to file before you say this to anyone else." "I know that too." She had filed within 3 weeks. Anonymously. Through a holding company she formed with the help of an attorney. Ji-hwan had never met a woman named Carla Voss who specialized in intellectual property and had an office in Midtown that Imani had found, absurdly, through a podcast recommendation. Carla was precise and unsentimental, and she'd looked at the filing strategy Imani proposed and said, "This is actually smart," in a tone that made Imani understand. It was a real compliment, not a polite one. Then Imani had gone back to the study and kept working. She brought in 2 additional researchers, both people Nadine trusted, both paid through the holding company out of a separate account Imani funded with savings she had accumulated, quietly, over 4 years of managing the household accounts Ji-hwan never looked at. She filed a second patent 6 months later, a third 14 months in. All of it done quietly. All of it done in a locked room in a house, where the man downstairs support research and managing dinner parties and making appropriate appearances at the events that benefited Seoryeon's reputation. She had told herself in the beginning that she was hiding the project because it wasn't ready. Because you didn't talk about work that wasn't finished yet, especially in a world where Ji-hwan's professional contacts moved fast and information had value. But the deeper truth, the one she didn't let herself look directly at for almost a year, was something else. Ji-hwan controlled the things he touched. He couldn't help it. It wasn't even malicious most of the time. It was simply how he was built. He had built an empire by understanding what he owned and what he could use and how every piece fit into the larger structure he was maintaining. His businesses, his alliances, his networks, everything existed in relationship to him and his purposes. She had watched him, over 11 years of marriage, absorb his younger brother's struggling import company into Seoryeon's structure to help him. She had watched him redirect the career of a lieutenant whose independent judgment he found inconvenient by promoting him sideways into a role that eliminated his autonomy. She had watched him make people grateful for the very thing that diminished them. She loved him. Or she had, and the remnants of that love were complicated in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She knew. But she knew she had always known, somewhere below the surface of the marriage, that if Ji-hwan discovered her work before she was ready, he would try to make it part of his world. He would offer to help. He would introduce her to his contacts. He would optimize the business structure and apply his networks and improve the deal terms, and within 18 months, something that had been hers alone would exist primarily in relation to him. She would become once again someone inside his empire. So she had kept the door locked, and she had worked. The night Yuna Kwan walked through the front door was a Thursday in November. The short ribs were good. Imani had made them well. She was a genuinely good cook, one of those domestic competencies she'd developed without ever quite meaning to. The wine was the correct temperature. The table looked exactly right. And Ji-hwan brought his mistress to the table and said she'd handled it well, and Imani cried on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes, and then she stood up and washed her face. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The eyes were red. The jaw was tight. The woman looking back at her was 39 years old and had 3 pharmaceutical patents in her name that her husband didn't know existed. She dried her face with one of the good towels, went back downstairs. Ji-hwan was on his phone in his study, the other one, on the 2nd floor, not the locked room on the 3rd. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway. "Heading to bed?" he asked. "Soon," she said. She went to the kitchen instead and poured herself the last of the wine, and stood at the counter and drank it slowly, looking at the dishes Yuna had helped clear, the glasses Ji-hwan had poured, the table where the three of them had sat together in some grotesque parody of a dinner party. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from Carla Voss. The Boston biotech firm had responded to the licensing proposal. Preliminary terms. Not final, but positive, more than positive. Imani read the email twice. She set the phone face down on the counter. She finished the wine, and she felt, underneath the grief and the anger and the exhaustion, something else beginning to take shape. Something small and precise, like the first calculation on a long proof. Something that was entirely hers. She rinsed her glass, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs. Ji-hwan was already asleep by the time she got to the bedroom. He slept the way he did everything, completely, without apparent difficulty, without visible doubt. Imani lay beside him in the dark and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep for a very long time, but she was thinking clearly, and that was enough. She was awake before the alarm. That had been happening more often lately, her body pulling her out of sleep at 5:15, before the city outside had fully committed to being morning. She lay still for a moment in the gray light and listened to Ji-hwan breathing beside her. Even and slow, completely undisturbed. She had married a man who slept like he had no unfinished business. Imani got up without touching him, pulled on a robe, and went downstairs to the kitchen. She made coffee the way she always did, ground the beans herself, used the pour-over, because the machine Ji-hwan had ordered from Japan made coffee that tasted expensive but hollow, and she had never said so out loud because it seemed like a small thing to fight about. Now, she looked at the Japanese machine sitting on the counter and thought about all the small things she had declined to fight about over 11 years, and she poured her coffee and took it upstairs to the locked study on the third floor. The room was cold. She hadn't been up here since the night before the dinner. Since before Yuna. She sat down at the desk and opened the laptop and pulled up Carla's email again. Preliminary licensing terms from the Boston firm. A number that 6 years ago she would not have believed attached to anything with her name on it. Not this early. Not with patents that hadn't even cleared the full commercial validation process yet. She read it 3 times, not because she didn't understand it the first time, because she needed to feel it settle. Then she closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went back downstairs to start the day. Ji-hwan was in the kitchen when she got there, already dressed, already moving through the space like he owned it, which he did, technically, which had never felt like a fact worth examining until recently. He was in a dark suit. Early meeting. He poured coffee from the Japanese machine without looking at it, and scrolled something on his phone, and said, without looking up, "The Halvorsen dinner is Friday." Imani opened the refrigerator. I remember. Where the green one? She stopped. The green dress. He meant the emerald silk she'd bought herself 2 winters ago, on a day she'd been alone in Midtown with an hour to kill between a meeting with Carla and a follow-up call with Nadine. She'd bought it because she wanted it, not for any occasion, and she'd worn it once to a company gala, and Ji-hwan had told her she looked appropriate for the event, which was the closest thing to a compliment he offered in public. Now he was directing her to wear it, not asking, directing. The way he directed table arrangements and meeting agendas and the careers of people who worked for him. "I'll figure out what to wear," she said. He looked up from his phone. Not sharply, more like recalibrating. He wasn't used to that sentence from her. She wasn't used to saying it. A moment passed between them that had some weight to it. Then his phone rang, and he answered it in Korean and took it to his office, and the moment dissolved. Imani stood at the open refrigerator for another 5 seconds. A sound like keen wood splitting. Then she took out the eggs and made her some breakfast and ate it alone at the kitchen counter, watching the November light come gray and flat through the window. And she felt something solidifying inside her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. Something that required patience to maintain and would not be rushed. She had 4 more months before she'd be ready. She could do 4 months. She had done 4 years of quiet already. 4 months was nothing. The Halvorsen dinner on Friday was the kind of event she could have seen by now. 4 people, a penthouse on Park Avenue, most of them connected to old money or new shipping contracts or both. all of them performing versions of themselves that bore only partial resemblance to who they actually were. That was true of everyone in Ji-hwan's world. Imani had spent a decade learning to see the performance and the person behind it simultaneously, which was a useful skill that no one had ever asked her to develop and no one had ever noticed she had. She wore a navy dress she hadn't worn in 2 years. Not the green one. Ji-hwan noticed. He said nothing. They got into the car together and rode 40 blocks in a silence that had its own particular texture, not comfortable, not hostile, just present, like weather. At the party, she watched him. She'd been doing this more consciously over the past year, studying Ji-hwan the way she studied a compound, not to understand the surface, but to map the structure underneath. He was different in rooms full of people than he was at home. At home, he could be silent and remote, which she'd once interpreted as depth and now understood, was simply a preference for not expending energy on things that didn't require management. In a room full of potential assets and liabilities, he was different. His attention sharpened. He moved through conversations with a purpose that looked like ease. He made people feel seen in short bursts and then moved on, depositing the feeling like currency. She watched him do it to Halvorsen himself, a 60-year-old Norwegian with shipping interests in the North Sea over the course of 11 minutes near the bar. She counted. 11 minutes, and the man was leaning in like Ji-hwan was the most interesting person he'd encountered in months. Which maybe he was. Ji-hwan was interesting. She'd never managed to stop believing that, even now. Dr. Whitfield. She turned. A woman she vaguely recognized, mid-50s, silver-haired, one of the Halvorsen firm's legal partners, was beside her, with a glass of white wine and the particular expression of someone who is also not entirely sure they want to be at this party. Eleanor Marsh, the woman said. Imani Whitfield. She offered her hand. I know who you are. I read your paper on compound stability, the 2017 one. I'm not a chemist, but I have a pharmacist brother who was very exercised about it. Imani felt something shift in her chest, a small, surprising warmth. The 2017 paper got a lot of people exercised. He said you were right, and the field wasn't ready to hear it. He wasn't wrong. They talked for 20 minutes about research, about the slow machinery of scientific consensus, about the particular frustration of having a good idea in an environment that rewards safety over accuracy. Eleanor Marsh was sharp and funny and didn't ask once what Ji-hwan thought about any of it, which made her, in that moment, one of the more refreshing people Imani had spoken to in months. When they parted and Imani turned back to the room, Ji-hwan was watching her from across the party. Not warmly, just watching, the way he watched things that required cataloging. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away first, which she almost never did. They rode home in silence again. Inside the townhouse, Ji-hwan poured himself a drink in the kitchen and stood at the counter and said, without preamble, "What were you talking to Eleanor Marsh about for 20 minutes?" "Science," Imani said. "She's in corporate litigation. Her brother is a pharmacist." She had questions. He drank. His eyes were on her over the glass. "You seemed engaged." "I was." He set the glass down. "I haven't seen you that engaged in a while." There it was, not concern, not curiosity. It was a data point he was filing. The wife was more animated at a party than usual. Eleanor Marsh. 20 minutes. Science questions. He was constructing something out of those pieces, and whatever he constructed was about information management, not about her. Imani looked at him steadily. "I'm engaged all the time." "You don't usually watch." It landed. Not like a blow, more like a stone dropping into very still water. The surface broke, and then it was quiet. Ji-hwan said nothing for a moment. "Then I watch." "Okay," Imani said, not agreeing. Just ending it. She went upstairs. That was a Thursday. By Sunday, Ji-hwan announced he was flying to Seoul. He said it at breakfast, casually, the way he said most things that were already decided, not a conversation, and informing. He had syndicate business in Busan that required his physical presence, though he framed it as board meetings for Sirion's Asia-Pacific operations, which was the language he always used. Imani had stopped asking the difference 4 years ago. "How long?" she asked. 8, 9 days, okay. He looked at her. "You'll be fine?" The question irritated her more than it should have. You'll be fine. Not I'll miss you. Not I'll call every night. You'll be fine, as though she were an arrangement that required a caretaker's assessment before he departed. I'll manage, she said. He left Monday morning. Before he got into the car, he kissed her cheek. The gesture was so habitual, it barely registered as a physical act anymore. She felt the brush of it and looked past his shoulder at the street. The car pulled away. Imani stood in the doorway of the townhouse until it turned the corner. Then she went inside, locked the front door, and went upstairs to the third floor and opened the study and called Nadine. He's gone for 9 days, she said when Nadine picked up. I know you're not calling to chat, Nadine said. The Boston term sheet needs a response by the 14th. That's while he's away. I want to move on it, a pause. You sure you're ready to do that while he's still in the picture legally? Carla's already structured it, so there's no legal intersection. The company is clean. The patents are clean. There's no argument that anything here touches marital assets. I know what Carla says. I'm asking if you're ready. Imani sat in the chair at the study desk. Outside, a siren passed somewhere below on the street, rose and faded. She thought about the bathroom floor, the good towels, the Japanese coffee machine she had never once complained about. I've been ready for a while, she said. I just wasn't finished. And now I'm finished. Nadine exhaled. Not dramatically, just the long, quiet exhale of someone recalibrating. Okay, call Carla. I'll have the technical summary on the compound projections to you by Wednesday. Thank you, Imani. Yeah, you're going to be okay. I know that too, Imani said, and she meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in a long time. She called Carla at 9 that morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Carla had drafted the response letter to the Boston firm. By Wednesday, Nadine's projections were in her inbox, and they were better than their most optimistic scenario. By Thursday, Imani had signed her name to a preliminary licensing agreement that would, over the next 18 months, make her independently wealthy. She did it in the locked study of Ji-hwan's townhouse, at the desk she'd bought herself, on the laptop he'd never opened. While he was in Seoul managing an empire she had spent years living at the edges of. She sat with it for a few minutes after the email confirmation came through. Just sat, let it be real. Then she went downstairs and made dinner and ate alone and watched something on television that she wouldn't be able to remember an hour later, and went to bed at 10 and actually slept deeply, without lying awake for the first time in months. Ji-hwan came back on a Sunday. The 9 days had done something to the air of the house. She wasn't sure if he felt it. He came in looking tired, which was unusual. He rarely showed tired, and he kissed her cheek again, the same habitual brush, and he asked if there was food. There was. She'd cooked earlier. They ate, and he talked about Seoul in the compressed, selective way. He always discussed his actual work fragments that formed a picture she'd learned to read sideways, the way you look at something bright without looking directly at it. Something had been complicated in Busan. Someone had disappointed him. He didn't name names, and she didn't ask, because she never asked, because those names and situations existed in a world he'd never fully let her into, and she'd accepted that at some point without formally deciding to. She watched him eat, and she thought about the signed agreement sitting in Carla's filing system. He had no idea. She wasn't sure if that felt like power or like grief. Maybe both. Maybe the line between them had always been thinner than she'd realized. That night in the bedroom, Ji-hwan said, "You seem different." She was reading. She looked up. Different how? He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him actually searching for the right word, which was rare. Ji-hwan usually had words precisely where he needed them. "Settled," he said finally. "I've been productive while you were gone," she said. He accepted that, turned off his lamp. She went back to her book and read the same paragraph 4 times before she absorbed it. The weeks after that had a surface calm that she understood was temporary. Ji-hwan did not bring Yuna to the house again. Whether that was a concession or simply a logistical adjustment, she didn't know and couldn't determine. Yuna's name didn't come up. Ji-hwan was occasionally attentive, asked about her work, though in a general disinterested way that confirmed he still thought of it as the New Jersey research position. He suggested they go to dinner at a restaurant they'd liked years ago, And they went, and the evening wasn't unpleasant. And on the way home, Imani looked out the car window and thought about all the ways a marriage could be technically functional and emotionally over at the same time. She didn't hate him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because hating him would have been simpler, and she wasn't in the business of lying to herself anymore. Ji-hwan was a man who had never fully opened his hand when it came to her, who had held her carefully and close, and whose care had slowly become a form of erasure. You can be kept by someone without being seen by them. You can be protected without being known. She had been both things for a long time, and she had called it love because she didn't have better language for it, and because she was afraid of what the better language would require. She understood all of that now. She also understood that it was almost time. The final trigger came on a Tuesday, 14 weeks after the dinner with Yuna. Ji-hwan was on a call in his study. She passed the door on the way upstairs and heard the voice he used when he spoke to Yuna, not affectionate exactly, more like careful, the particular register of a person managing someone they don't want to lose but don't want to prioritize. She knew that register. She'd heard it turned on other people for years. She stopped in the hallway, listened for 3 seconds, just long enough to confirm what it was. Then she kept walking. She went to the third-floor study, sat down and opened a blank document. She wrote 2 lines. Then she closed it and opened Carla's last email and read through the complete summary of where everything stood: the company, the patents, the licensing deal, the account structure, the projected earnings for the next 24 months. She read it slowly, all the way through. When she was done, she picked up her phone and called her sister in Atlanta, who had never met Ji-hwan and had said exactly once, in 2019, "I don't know why you're making yourself smaller for that man." And Imani had changed the subject, and they hadn't talked about it since. Her sister picked up on the third ring. "Hey, you." "Hey." Imani's voice was steady. "I need to tell you something." Pause. Her sister knew her well enough to let it breathe. "Okay, I'm leaving Ji-hwan." The words were the first time she'd said them out loud to another person. They sat in the air of the locked room, and they were solid, and they were real, and they did not feel as enormous as she'd expected. They felt like something that had been waiting to be named. Her sister said quietly, finally, "That was all." Just that one word. And Imani pressed her hand flat on the desk and breathed once, all the way in, all the way out, and said, "I'm almost ready. I just needed someone to know." She asked her sister not to call during the week. Ji-hwan had coming up another soul trip, supposedly. She'd explain everything afterward. She'd explain the company, the patents, the years of work behind a locked door, all of it. But not yet. "Take your time," her sister said. "I don't have much left to take." She hung up. Downstairs, she could hear Ji-hwan ending his call. His footsteps in the study below. The sound of a drawer opening and closing. The quiet, competent sounds of a man entirely at home inside the world he'd built. She turned off the study light and sat in the dark for a moment. She thought about the bathroom floor. She thought about the green dress. She thought about 11 years of adjusting. She thought about the signing confirmation sitting in Carla's system. Then she got up, went downstairs, and made tea. And when Ji-hwan emerged from his study and saw her in the kitchen, he asked if she'd made enough for 2. She had. She poured him a cup. They stood in the kitchen together and drank their tea and talked about nothing in particular, something about the weather. Something about a restaurant that had opened your eye in. Imani responded at the right moments and looked at him and thought, 4 more weeks. Maybe 3. Ji-hwan had no idea that the woman standing across from him in his kitchen had already left. She was just waiting for her work to tell her it was time. And 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, when Ji-hwan's bags were packed for Seoul, and his car was 10 minutes away, Carla Voss called to confirm that the first payment under the licensing agreement had cleared into the company account ahead of schedule. No complications. Everything exactly as it was supposed to be. And Imani said, "Thank you," and hung up and walked downstairs and stood in the middle of the townhouse foyer and felt the weight of it settle through her, like a door finally closing on its own. Ji-hwan came downstairs with his travel bag and found her standing there. "You okay?" he asked him. "I'm good," she said. He kissed her cheek. got in the car. She watched the car leave. Then she went upstairs to the bedroom and pulled 2 suitcases from the top of the closet and set them on the bed and opened them. She packed slowly and would splitting. She packed slowly and taking only what was hers, and everything she took was hers, because she had bought her own things for years without ever fully realizing that was what she was doing. She packed for 4 hours. When she was done, she carried the bags downstairs and set them by the front door and sat in the chair by the window that looked out onto the street. Ji-hwan's flight would land in Seoul in 13 hours. He would be back in 8 days. She had already booked a short-term apartment in the West Village first, and last month's rent, paid from the company account, under the company name, clean and separate, and entirely hers. She sat by the window. She did not turn on the television. She did not call anyone. She just sat and breathed and watched the street and let the silence of the townhouse be what it was, a place she had lived, and tended, and disappeared inside, and was now finally preparing to leave. When Ji-hwan's car turned back into the block, 9 days later, her suitcases were still by the door. She heard the engine. She stood up. She smoothed her jacket. And when the front door opened, and he came in carrying his travel bag and looked at her, and then at the suitcases, and something shifted fast across his face, confusion, before he could stop it. And underneath that, the beginning of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. She looked at him steadily and said the 2 words she had been preparing to say for longer than either of them knew. "I'm leaving." Ji-hwan didn't move. That was the first thing. He stood in the doorway of his own townhouse, with his travel bag still over his shoulder, and he looked at the 2 suitcases by the door, and then at Imani, and he didn't move, which was unusual, because Ji-hwan always moved with purpose. Even standing still, he usually occupied space with intention. Right now he just looked like a man who had walked into a room and found the floor missing. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the voice he used when he already knew the answer and was deciding how much time to spend on it. "I told you," Imani said. "I'm leaving." He set the travel bag down slowly, closed the front door behind him. The click of the latch was very loud in the quiet of the foyer. "Imani, don't. You haven't let me, Ji-hwan." Her voice was level. Not cold, exactly level, the way a table is level, because something underneath it has been carefully measured. "I've been thinking about this for longer than you realize. This isn't a reaction. This isn't about one night." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the suitcases again, and she watched him doing what he always did, reading the situation, cataloging details, looking for the variable that could be adjusted. "Where are you going?" he said. "That's not something I'm going to tell you right now." "You're my wife." "I know what I am," she said. "That's part of the problem." Something shifted in his face. Not anger. Ji-hwan didn't go to anger quickly, which had always been one of the more unsettling things about him. Most people, when threatened, reached for heat. Ji-hwan reached for stillness. His eyes got very quiet and very focused, and you felt, standing in front of that you were being measured against a standard you hadn't been told about. "You're upset about Yuna," he said. "I already told you Yuna isn't why I'm leaving. She's just the last thing." "Then explain it to me." "I've been explaining it for years. You weren't listening." That landed. She saw it land, the small tightening around his jaw, the breath he took through his nose. He wasn't a man who accepted being told he'd failed at something, especially not something he'd believed was under control. He moved then, not toward the door, not toward her bags, toward the kitchen, which meant he needed the counter between them, needed something to do with his hands. She followed because she wasn't going to stand in the foyer and shout at his back. He poured water, didn't drink it, set the glass down. "You want me to apologize for Yuna. I want you to understand that an apology for Yuna wouldn't change anything fundamental." "Then what would?" She almost laughed. Not cruelly, it just struck her as so perfectly, precisely Ji-hwan. "What would change things? Give me the variable. Tell me the adjustment." He was trying to solve her, the way he solved everything. And the terrible irony was that this capacity for relentless problem solving was something she had once loved about him. "Nothing would change things," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. This is done. You're throwing away 11 years. You threw them away. I'm just being honest about what's left. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car alarm started up somewhere on the street and ran for 10 seconds and stopped. I can fix this, he said. Ji-hwan, I can fix it. Whatever you need. Stop. She put her hands flat on the kitchen counter. Listen to what you're saying. You don't know what I need. You've never asked what I need. You're telling me you can fix it because fixing things is what you do, not because you understand what's broken. He looked at her. Tell me then, he said. Tell me what's broken. And for a moment, just a moment, she felt the pull of it. The old habit of explanation. The 12 years of hoping that if she just found the right words, the right angle, the right moment, he would finally hear her the way she needed to be heard. She recognized the pull and she let it pass. I'm going to pick up my bags, she said. I'm going to leave. You can call your attorney tomorrow. Mine is already informed. Something changed in his face. Your attorney, Carla Voss, Midtown. She specializes in intellectual property, and she's been my attorney for over a year. She said it deliberately. She wasn't sure why, maybe. Because she was tired of performing ignorance in this house. Maybe because she wanted just once to let him see that she had been living a parallel life inside his walls for longer than he'd imagined. She watched the name land, watched him file it. Intellectual property, he said. Yes. What intellectual property? Imani picked up her coat from the chair where she'd laid it 2 hours ago in preparation for this exact moment. She put it on, buttoned it slowly. You'll find out, she said. I'm not hiding anything. I just want to be gone before we get into it. Imani, his voice changed register. Lower, something in it that was close to the thing she'd been waiting 11 years to hear and had stopped expecting. I know I haven't. I know there are things I didn't. Don't, she said quietly. Please, not right now. Not like this. Because she could feel it, the place in her chest where the feeling lived, the part that still responded to his voice when it went low like that. She wasn't a robot. She hadn't amputated everything. And she knew, she absolutely knew, that if she stood in this kitchen for another 10 minutes, listening to him find the words he should have found 5 years ago, she would either scream or she would stay, and she couldn't afford either. She picked up the strap of the first suitcase. Ji-hwan didn't stop her. He stood at the kitchen counter with the untouched glass of water, and he watched her drag the first suitcase to the door, and then the second, and she opened the front door, and the night air came in, cold and clean and smelling like the city, and she stood in the doorway with her 2 bags, and she looked back at him. He was still standing in the kitchen. His face was very still. Not the calculated stillness, this was something else. This was a man who had just discovered that a wall he'd been leaning on for 11 years was not structural. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. It wasn't right. It wasn't enough. It was also the most honest thing he'd said to her in months, and she recognized it as such. I already know where to look, she said. She pulled the door closed behind her. The car she'd called was waiting at the curb. The driver helped with the bags without being asked. She got in and looked straight ahead as the car pulled out, and she did not look at the townhouse as they passed it. She was 6 blocks away before she realized her hands were shaking. Not badly, just the small residual tremor of having done something enormous, and survived it. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed and watched the city slide past the windows, and she thought about nothing specific for a while, which was its own kind of relief. The West Village apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and radiator heat. She'd never lived anywhere that smelled like that, and she found putting her key in the lock for the first time that she liked it. The apartment was small, clean. The previous tenant had left the kitchen in good order. The windows looked out onto a quiet street where a coffee shop was still lit up at 10 at night, and she stood at the window for a few minutes after the driver left and watched the 2 people inside talking, and she felt so many things at once that she stopped trying to name them. She made up the bed with the linens she'd packed, and she set her laptop on the small table by the window, and she sent Carla a text that said, "I'm out." Carla responded in 4 minutes, "Good. Call me tomorrow at 9. She set the phone face down and went to sleep. The next 3 weeks were the most productive of her adult life. Without the weight of performing normalcy inside the townhouse. Without the management of evenings and dinners and appearances, something in her cleared. She worked from the apartment and from a shared lab space in Brooklyn that Nadine had arranged access to through a university connection. She and Nadine pushed the research on the secondary compound application, the one that had the potential to extend the scope of the first patent's commercial use, and by the end of the second week, they had enough data to brief the Boston firm on a possible amendment to the existing agreement. She talked to her sister twice. She had dinner with Nadine one evening at a Thai restaurant in Park Slope, and they stayed 3 hours and talked about the work, and also about things that had nothing to do with the work. A book Nadine had read, a neighborhood in Port-au-Prince that Nadine's mother had described in letters, a documentary about deep-sea fish that Imani had watched alone at midnight and found unexpectedly moving. She laughed more in those 3 hours than she had in the previous year combined. She did not talk to Ji-hwan. He called twice. She did not answer. She forwarded both calls to Carla's office, which was where all formal communication should go anyway. She was in the middle of the third week when Nadine called at 7 in the morning, and Imani knew from the first second of silence after she said hello that something was wrong. Nadine, there's a problem. Imani set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. Tell me. Marcus called me last night. Marcus Webb, the younger of the 2 additional researchers they'd brought into the project. 29 years old, brilliant in a focused, specific way that Imani valued, the kind of researcher who could run 3 parallel test protocols without losing thread. She'd trusted him because Nadine trusted him, and Nadine didn't trust casually. What did he say? Imani said. He's been approached. The kitchen of the small apartment went very quiet. By who? Imani said. He doesn't know the name. Someone reached out through a professional contact, framed it as a consulting inquiry. High-end specific questions about compound stability pathways. Specifically the modification approach you filed at the first patent. Imani's hand was very still on the table. Who has access to that level of specificity? That's what I've been sitting with since midnight, Nadine said. The patent filings are public record. But the methodology, the specific questions they were asking Marcus about, that's not in the public filings. That's the level of detail you only have if you've read the internal research documentation. Imani closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. Or if you had access to the study. I didn't want to say that. Who else has been approached? I don't know yet. I called you first, called David. David Osei, the 4th member of the team, who worked remotely from a university lab in Philadelphia. Steady, meticulous, the most professionally cautious person on the team. Call him right now, while I'm on with you. She heard Nadine dialing on another line. Heard the wait. Then Nadine's voice, tense and low, talking to someone Imani couldn't fully hear. She stood up from the table and walked to the window. The street below was quiet. The coffee shop wasn't open yet. Her mind was moving fast and precise, the way it moved when she was working, not panicking, not scattering, just running the variables. Ji-hwan had heard the name Carla Voss. He had heard the words intellectual property. He was not a man who heard things and let them sit unexamined. He had people who found things. He had a network that could pull information from places that had no obvious connection to him. She'd known this. She'd structured the company and the patents exactly to withstand it. Carla had been thorough. The corporate veil was clean. But the internal research documentation was different. It had never lived anywhere but her laptop and a secure shared server that only she, Nadine, Marcus, and David had access to. Nadine came back. David says no contact, but he sounds scared. Tell him not to respond to anything without talking to me first. Already told him. What did Marcus say when they approached him? What was the ask? To provide a technical assessment, essentially to validate or refute certain aspects of the methodology. Paid work framed as legitimate consulting. He said no. He said he needed to think about it. That's why he called me. Imani pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose. Get me his number. I'm calling him directly. Marcus picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for it. I was going to call you today, he said. His voice was careful. Not guilty careful, like someone navigating ice. Tell me everything, Imani said. from the beginning. Exactly how it was framed, he told her. It had come through a former classmate from his graduate program who was now working for a consulting firm in Connecticut. The inquiry was framed as standard industry, consulting a pharmaceutical company, evaluating a potential licensing target, and wanting independent technical assessment. The questions were precise, Marcus said, uncomfortably precise. They had referenced the first patent by filing number and had asked specifically about the stability modification in language that mirrored, almost exactly, the internal nomenclature Imani had developed and used in the private research documents. Did your former classmate know what the actual project was? Imani said. He said he was just passing along the inquiry. But Imani Marcus stopped. Say it, the consulting firm. I looked it up this morning. It's 18 months old, registered in Delaware. It's clean on the surface, but the registered agent, he stopped again. Could hear him deciding how to say it. The registered agent is also the registered agent for 6 other entities. 2 of them are subsidiaries of a holding company called Ji-hwan Pacific Capital. The name hit her like cold water. She stood at the window of the West Village apartment and absorbed it, and she did not make a sound. Ji-hwan Pacific Capital, Ji-hwan's, a subsidiary of the legitimate side of his operation, used mostly for real estate and private equity holdings. She knew the name because she'd signed tax documents that referenced it 3 years ago when they'd been jointly assessed on some of the domestic investment portfolio. She'd signed them and filed them away and not thought about them since. He had found her in 3 weeks. Not the company she'd expected him to find the company. She'd built the company to withstand his finding it. But the research, the internal layer, the documentation that was supposed to exist only between the 4 of them. Something was wrong with the perimeter. Marcus, she said. Yeah. Who sent you the secure server invitation when you came onto the project? Silence. Nadine sent it, he said. And the access credentials, did you set those up yourself, or did someone generate them for you? I set them up. But his voice dropped. There's something else. Tell me. The classmate who reached out. After I told him I needed to think about it, he sent me a follow-up message. He said the people he was working with already had what they needed from a primary source. He said they were approaching team members as a verification step. The apartment was very quiet. Primary source. A primary source, she said. That's what he said. She hung up. She didn't say goodbye. She just pressed the button and set the phone on the table and stood looking at it. Primary source meant someone who had been inside, not someone who had observed from outside the perimeter, not someone who had constructed it from patent filings and corporate registrations. Someone who had been inside the research. There were 4 people on this project. She trusted Nadine with her life, not metaphorically. Genuinely. David was in Philadelphia and had been there the entire time, and his communication records were as clean as anyone's she'd ever worked with. Which left Marcus, who had called Nadine to flag the approach. Or it left a 5th person she hadn't accounted for. She called Carla. Carla picked up immediately, which meant Carla had already heard something, because Carla did not pick up at 7:45 in the morning immediately unless she was expecting a call. Tell me you already know about this, Imani said. I got a call this morning from the attorney representing a company called Meridian Pharma Consulting. I've never heard of them. They're not in any of our competitive landscape research. Carla's voice was clipped and precise. They're asserting a prior claim on one element of the second patent's methodology. Imani sat down. On what basis, she said. Unpublished research documentation. They're claiming their client was working on a parallel approach and that the modification pathway in Patent 2 was derived from or influenced by access to that work. Carla paused. It's not a strong claim on its face. But Imani, if they have internal documentation that mirrors yours closely enough to create a credible overlap argument, it becomes expensive and slow, even if we win. They're not asserting a parallel development, Imani said. They're using documentation they shouldn't have. I know that. You know that. Proving it is a different conversation. Who filed the opposing claim? It was filed anonymously through Meridian. I'm working on tracing the beneficial ownership. Look for connections to Ji-hwan Pacific Capital. Pause. Imani. Just look. She hung up and sat in the small apartment in the gray morning light and thought about 11 years. About a locked study. About a laptop that had never left her hands. The laptop had never left her hands, but the server had credentials. And credentials could be accessed from outside if someone had the right token. She opened her laptop and navigated to the secure server's access, logged something she'd checked periodically during the project as a precaution, but never found anything concerning it. She went back 3 months, 2 months, 6 weeks. There, an access entry from an IP address she didn't recognize. 42 days ago, 11 in the evening, she'd been in the West Village apartment. By then she'd moved out after that dinner, which meant 42 days ago she was still in the townhouse. She stared at the entry. 42 days ago she had been in the townhouse. The laptop had been in the locked study. The study had been locked. But Ji-hwan had keys to every room in that house. She sat very still. He had known. Not about everything, not about the full scope of it, or he wouldn't have been sending Marcus's classmate around asking verification questions. But he had known enough. He'd been inside the server. He or someone he'd sent had accessed the research documentation and taken what they needed, and he had spent the past 42 days building a case. The man she'd spent 3 weeks thinking she had left cleanly. The man who'd said in the kitchen, "I can fix this." He hadn't been trying to fix the marriage. He'd been buying time. She stood up so fast, the chair scraped back against the floor. She called Nadine. "Check your server access logs from the last 60 days. Right now. What am I looking for? An IP address you don't recognize. Anything that accessed the compound documentation files." She heard Nadine moving, opening things, the sound of keys. Then silence, then Imani. "What?" "There are 2 entries. One from 42 days ago and one from Nadine stopped." "Imani, there's one from 11 days ago, after you left the townhouse." 11 days ago meant someone was still inside the server. Not Ji-hwan himself. He didn't have those technical capabilities, and he knew it, and he would have used someone. He had people for everything. He had people whose entire function was knowing things other people didn't know they knew. "Lock the server," Imani said. "Right now. Revoke all credentials and generate new ones. Don't send the new ones to anyone until you've talked to me." "Already doing it." And Nadine, she stopped, made herself say it. "Is there any possibility, Marcus?" "No." Nadine's voice was flat. "I know Marcus. He called me. If he was the leak, he wouldn't have called. Someone gave them a primary source." "I know that too," Nadine said. "I'm thinking." Imani walked to the window again. The coffee shop was open now. A woman in a yellow coat was standing outside it with a cup, looking at her phone, entirely unconcerned with anything beyond her immediate mourning. Somewhere across the city, Ji-hwan had spent 42 days building a case out of her own research. She had protected the company structure. She had protected the patents. She had protected everything she could see. She had not protected the server because she had trusted the 4 people who had access to it, and that trust had been right. But the technology had failed her, or someone had found a way in that she hadn't anticipated. And now the thing she'd spent 14 months building was under attack from the inside out. She could fight it. She knew that Carla would fight it. The claim was thin and opportunistic, and if it went to litigation, they would win. Eventually. Eventually meant months. Months meant the Boston Agreement could be challenged, frozen, delayed. Months meant the secondary compound research stalled while legal consumed the oxygen. Months meant Ji-hwan had achieved the one thing she'd designed every layer of this to prevent. He had gotten inside. She turned away from the window. She thought about the way he'd said, "I can fix this." She thought about the hand at Yuna's lower back. She thought about all the things she'd locked away in that study, the years of work, the careful architecture, the version of herself she'd been reconstructing one, late night at a time. She thought about what it meant that the man she'd spent 11 years inside a marriage with had responded to her, walking away by going after the only thing she'd told him was hers. She picked up her phone. She called Carla again. "I need to know something," she said when Carla answered. "If he pursues this, if Meridian files a full claim, and it goes to litigation, what are the real odds?" Carla didn't answer immediately. That pause was its own answer. "We win," Carla said. The claim is manufactured, but manufactured claims are expensive to defeat, and the Boston firm will want stability in the agreement while it's pending, and there will be pressure to settle. If we settle, we're probably giving up some percentage of the secondary patent's commercial scope, maybe 20–25% of future earnings from that application. And if we fight, full litigation, 18 months minimum, during which the secondary agreement is likely suspended. Imani breathed. What does he want, she said, in your read? What does Ji-hwan actually want out of this? Carla was quiet for a moment. I think he wants you to come to the table. I think this isn't about the patents. Imani stood in the middle of the small apartment. She looked at the 2 suitcases she hadn't fully unpacked yet. She looked at the desk by the window where she'd been working for 3 weeks with more clarity and more momentum than she'd had in years. She looked at the view of the quiet street and the coffee shop and the woman in the yellow coat who was gone now. She thought about what it would cost her to go back to that table. And she thought about what it would cost her not to. And she understood standing there in the gray morning light of an apartment she'd chosen for herself, that the hardest part of what she'd built was not the research, and not the illegal architecture, and not the years of quiet and discipline and patience inside a locked study. The hardest part was that Ji-hwan knew her well enough to know exactly where to strike, and she was going to have to find a way to be someone he didn't know at all. She didn't sleep that night, not a single hour. She lay on the bed in the West Village apartment with her eyes open and the ceiling above her, doing nothing except existing, and she let the problem run. That was what she did with problems that were too large to solve. By forcing them, she let them run. The way you let a centrifuge run. Trusting the process would separate things that needed to be separated if you gave it enough time and didn't interfere. By 2 in the morning, she had the outline of it. By 3, she was at the desk, with the legal pad and the laptop, and a cold cup of coffee she'd made and forgotten, and she was writing. Not the legal strategy, Carla owned that. What she was writing was the technical counter-narrative. The document that would exist behind the legal filing, the one that translated the lab notebooks into language that a judge and a jury and a competing attorney who had never run a synthesis protocol in their life could follow well enough to understand what Meridian was actually claiming and why it was impossible. She wrote for 4 hours. At 7, she sent it to Carla with a message. Read this before you draft the dismissal motion. The technical narrative needs to be embedded in the filing, not attached as an exhibit. It needs to be in the body of the argument. Carla responded in 11 minutes, already at my desk. Give me an hour. She showered, made fresh coffee, ate toast again because her appetite still wasn't operating at full capacity, and toast was something she could get through without having to think about it. She stood at the window while she ate and watched the street come alive. Not the coffee shop opening, the first few pedestrians moving with the particular purposeful lean of people who had somewhere to be at 7:30 in the morning and knew it. Her phone rang, not Carla, not Nadine. Ji-hwan, she looked at it for 3 full rings. She didn't answer. She let it go to voicemail and stood very still while the voicemail notification appeared, and she did not listen to it. Not yet. Whatever he had to say, she needed the next several hours to be completely clear of him, of his voice, his register, the particular frequency he operated on, that she had spent 11 years learning to read, and which still, despite everything, had the capacity to disrupt her thinking if she let it in at the wrong moment. She would listen to the voicemail when the legal framework was filed and immovable. Not before. Carla called at 8:45. The technical narrative is exactly what we needed. I'm integrating it now. Preston is in the office, and he agrees this approach is stronger than a standard dismissal motion. We're not just arguing procedural deficiency. We're arguing factual impossibility. Their claim cannot be true given the documented record. Good. I want to file today before noon. Do it. There's one more thing. Carla's voice shifted slightly, not softer, just more deliberate. I traced the Meridian beneficial ownership. 2 layers of holding companies, both registered offshore, but the terminal owner is a limited partnership registered in the Cayman Islands called Capital Partners. Imani set down the coffee cup and Bairai Capital Partners is 40% owned by a person named Byun Ryong Young. Carla paused. which is Ji-hwan's mother's name. The apartment went very quiet. Imani stood in it. She knew that name. She had met the woman twice, formal occasions, both times the kind of meeting that was more like an assessment than a social event. Bayan Ryong-young was 70 years old, had built her own commercial real estate business in Seoul in the 80s before marrying into a family that subsequently lost most of its money, and had spent 40 years being quietly, precisely the most influential person in any room she occupied, without ever needing to raise her voice or make herself obvious about it. Ji-hwan had gotten that from her. He didn't set up Meridian himself, Imani said. No. Or if he did it through his mother's capital structure, which is either a very sophisticated attempt to distance himself from the action, or she did it independently, Imani said. Silence. You think she moved without him knowing, Carlissa said. I think it's possible. She's not a woman who waits for instructions. Imani thought about it, running the logic. She's known about me for 11 years. She's never approved of me, not overtly, but you could feel it. I was not what she wanted for him, and she was too controlled to say so, and too strategic to let it go. If she moved independently and Ji-hwan finds out, he'll be furious. Imani said it flatly. Not with satisfaction, just accurately. He doesn't like being used as a vehicle for someone else's purposes. Even hers, especially hers. That might actually help us, Carla said carefully. It might. She thought about the voicemail sitting unopened on her phone. File the motion. If Ji-hwan is calling me, I want the legal action already in the record before I talk to him. Understood. By noon, she hung up and looked at the phone. Then she picked it up and listened to the voicemail. Ji-hwan's voice was controlled. It was always controlled. But she'd spent 11 years learning the frequencies under the control, and what she heard under it now was something she hadn't heard from him before, or hadn't heard clearly enough to name. A man in a situation he hadn't fully chosen and wasn't certain how to navigate. He said, I know Carla has been working on a response to the Meridian filing. I want you to know that I need to talk to you. Not through attorneys. I'm asking you to call me back. That was it. He didn't explain the Meridian claim. He didn't defend it. He didn't offer anything. He just said he needed to talk to her. She listened to it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and went to the Brooklyn lab. She needed her hands in the work. She needed the specific gravity of actual research to keep the morning from becoming entirely about Ji-hwan and Byun Ryong-young and Meridian and server access logs and all the mechanisms of a situation she had not started and was going to have to dismantle with her own hands, while simultaneously not letting it consume the thing that actually mattered. Nadine was already in the lab when she arrived. You look terrible, Nadine said. Thank you. Did you sleep? No, Imani, I'll sleep tonight. Right now I need to run the stability comparison on the secondary compound samples from Tuesday. I need my hands on something real. Nadine looked at her for a moment, the particular look of someone who knows better than to push, but is registering a concern for the record. Then she moved aside and let Imani at the bench. She worked for 2 hours. It was as it had always been, the right thing. The bench was real. The samples were real. The data that came back from the instruments was real in a way that legal filings and offshore holding companies and 11-year marriages were not because those things didn't matter, but because they were constructed by people, and could be. Constructed wrong, while the compound either behaved the way the data said it would behave, or it didn't, and the data didn't have an agenda. At 10:15, her phone buzzed on the bench. Carla motion filed. Case number confirmed. On the record as of 10:08 this morning. She showed the screen to Nadine without comment. Nadine read it. Exhaled. Okay. Imani agreed. She set the phone down and finished the stability comparison, because the stability comparison was what she'd come to do and she was going to finish it before she let the other thing back in. The data was good. Better than Tuesday's. The secondary compound was behaving. She wrote it up in her lab notebook, dated, detailed, the way Nadine had taught her to maintain those records back at the beginning, when this had all been just a possibility, and some handwritten notes in a locked study. And then she closed the notebook and cleaned the bench and stripped. her gloves, and threw them away and washed her hands. She called Ji-hwan from the hallway outside the lab. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been holding the phone. "Thank you for calling," he said. "I filed the dismissal motion this morning," she said. "It's in the record. Whatever we say now has no legal effect on that." "I know. Tell me about Meridian." A pause. Not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. But in Ji-hwan's particular economy of silence, 2 seconds meant something. "I found out about it 4 days ago," he said. "Your mother." Another pause, shorter. "Yes, she moved without telling you." She stopped. She heard him choose the next word carefully. "Acted on what she believed were my interests. Without consulting me. And are you going to defend that?" "No." His voice was flat. The flatness of someone who has had a version of this conversation already, probably in Korean, probably with considerable heat behind it, even if the volume had remained controlled. "I've already spoken to the attorney she used to structure Meridian. I've told them to withdraw the filing." Imani stood in the hallway outside the lab and absorbed that. "Before or after I filed the dismissal motion," she said. "Before. I called them yesterday afternoon. It apparently takes time, she said. "Imani, Carla's office will have received the withdrawal notice. I'm going to call her when we're done." She kept her voice level. Not cold level, the table. "I need to understand something. Ask the server access. 42 days ago, and again 11 days after I left. Your mother's people are yours." Silence. Ji-hwan. "Mine," he said. "I had someone access it, before I knew what I was looking at. Before I understood what the company was." He paused. "The second access I had pulled back by then. I don't know where the second entry came from. I've been trying to determine that. Your mother's people had the credentials from the first access." A long pause, he said. His voice was very controlled. She knew what that level of control cost him. "I don't know yet. I'm working to find out." "The woman who approached Marcus, was that yours or hers?" "Hers." He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd confirmed it already, and it had made him angry. "I didn't know about that either." Imani leaned against the wall of the hallway. Closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. "So here is what happened," she said. "You accessed my server. You saw the research. You saw the scope of it. You didn't know what to do with that information. And while you were figuring it out, your mother saw an opportunity and built an entire legal action on the back of your intelligence gathering without telling you." He said nothing. "And now the filing is being withdrawn, and the dismissal motion is in the record, and we're talking on the phone, and you want me to understand that it was more complicated than it looked. I want you to understand that I didn't sanction what she did," he said. "The server access was mine. I own that. The rest of it is still downstream of what you started," Imani said. He went quiet. She let the quiet be there. "Yes," he said finally. "It is," she breathed. This was the thing about Ji-hwan. She thought the thing that made him maddening, and also, in this moment, bearable to talk to. When the argument was over, and the position was untenable, he didn't pivot. He didn't find a new angle. He acknowledged the reality of what was in front of him, because his intelligence had always been too precise to sustain a lie he couldn't make himself believe. It had been one of the things she'd loved. "Withdraw everything," she said. "Every element. Confirm it to Carla by end of business today. It's done. I want the confirmation in writing. You'll have it." She straightened away from the wall. "I have to go back to work, Imani." His voice shifted. Lower. The frequency she'd spent 11 years learning to read. "I know you don't want to hear this. Then maybe don't say it." "I have to," he breathed. She could hear it, the actual physical breath, which was unusual from him. Usually his breathing was invisible. "I've spent 30 years building things by understanding what I could control. I controlled the business. I controlled the networks. I controlled the risks. I thought I was doing the same thing in our marriage. Managing the variables, keeping everything stable." She said nothing. "And then you walked out," he said, "and I realized that what I'd been doing wasn't keeping you. It was just keeping you from leaving as long as there was nowhere else to go. The moment you had somewhere to go, you went. The hallway was empty. A researcher she didn't know passed at the far end, glancing at her, moving on. The building hummed with the ordinary noise of a laboratory floor ventilation systems, distant equipment, the low vibration of things that were designed to run continuously. "That's accurate," she said. "I should have seen you." "I didn't see you." "No," she said, "you didn't." "I don't know what I'm asking for," he said. "I'm not asking you to come back. I understand that's not—" He stopped. "I just needed you to know that I understand what I did, and what I didn't do, and that I understand the difference." She stood in the hallway and held the phone, and felt the weight of 11 years pressing against the moment, not crushing it. Just present, the way the weight of anything real is always present, even when you've learned to carry it differently. "I know you understand it," she said. "I know that about you. You always understand things, eventually. The understanding just usually comes after the damage." He made a sound that wasn't quite a response, more like receiving something. "Take care of yourself, Ji-hwan," she said. "I mean that." She hung up. She stood in the hallway for 30 seconds. Then she went back into the lab. Nadine looked at her from across the bench. "Didn't ask. It's handled," Imani said. "Good. The withdrawal is going to hit Carla's office today. The dismissal motion runs clean." "Good," Nadine said again. Imani pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. "Where are we on the Phase 3 timeline?" Nadine blinked. "You want to talk about Phase 3 right now?" "I want to talk about Phase 3 right now." Nadine looked at her for a moment, the same registering look as before, except this time there was something else in it. Something that was close to the specific quality of respect that scientists have for other scientists who refuse to let the work stop, even when everything around it is on fire. "Phase 3, Nadine said. "Okay, come look at this." They worked for 4 more hours. The withdrawal confirmation reached Carla's office at 3:47 that afternoon, formal, complete, with the signatures of both Meridian's attorney of record and a secondary counsel Imani assumed represented Byun Ryong-young's direct interests. Carla forwarded it to Imani with the subject line, "Clean." "Clean," she read it once, saved it. Closed the email. She was in the Brooklyn lab, still, standing at the bench, with the Phase 3 sequencing data spread across 2 monitors, a problem in the protein interaction modeling that had been giving her trouble for a week and had started, in the past hour, to show the edges of a solution, not the solution itself, but the shape of where the solution was, which was how it usually started. You saw the outline before you saw what was inside it. Nadine was on the phone at the far end of the lab, talking to the university contact about the next phase's institutional requirements. Marcus had left early. He'd had a personal errand, had asked Imani at noon. She'd said yes, without asking what the errand was, because she'd been thinking about the protein interaction problem. And because she trusted him, and because it wasn't her business. David was in Philadelphia and had sent a careful, thorough email at 2 o'clock, with 3 questions about the sequencing protocol that were good questions, the kind that made you go back and check something you'd thought was settled. She answered David's email first. Then she went back to the protein interaction problem. She worked until 7. When she finally pulled back from the monitors and straightened her spine and felt the specific ache of having been bent over a bench for hours, she noticed that the lab had emptied at some point while she wasn't paying attention. Nadine had left a note on the bench, a physical note, handwritten, because Nadine did not fully trust digital communication for personal messages that said, "You figured out the protein issue. You just haven't let yourself see it yet. Go home and sleep, and it will be there in the morning." Then below that, "Also, you were right about the secondary stability trend. I reran it. Those numbers are real." Imani read the note twice. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. The night air outside the lab building hit her like something physical, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of the harbor 2 blocks away. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in and felt the day settle through her, all of it. The voicemail and the phone call, Carla's test on single-word email, and 4 hours at the bench with the protein interaction problem that was going to resolve itself in the morning the way Nadine said it would. She thought about the stability trend numbers. She thought about what those numbers meant for the secondary compound application. She thought about the Boston brief. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app and wrote 3 lines of technical notation while they were clear in her head, because this was how it worked. The work didn't wait for convenient moments. It came when it came, and you either caught it or you didn't. She caught it. Then she put the phone away and started walking toward the subway. 2 blocks from the lab, she passed a woman coming out of a grocery store with 2 bags, fumbling with her keys. Imani held the door for her without thinking about it. The woman thanked her. Imani nodded and kept walking. Small things. The subway car was half empty at this hour, and she got a seat, which she didn't usually get in the evening. And she sat with her bag on her lap, and her eyes not quite focused on anything specific, and she thought about what Ji-hwan had said on the phone. I've spent 30 years building things by understanding what I could control. She knew that. She'd known it from the beginning. It was part of what had drawn her to him, that capacity, that precision, the way he moved through complex systems with the confidence of someone who had mapped them. She'd admired it, and she'd also slowly, invisibly, become one of the things he'd mapped and managed, and the transition between those 2 states had been so gradual that neither of them had noticed it happening. That was the real story, wasn't it? Not the betrayal with Yuna that was a symptom. Not the server access, not the meridian filing, not any of the specific events of the past several months. The real story was 11 years of a woman being slowly fitted into a shape that served someone else's architecture, and the slow accumulation of that pressure, and the locked room she'd created to escape it, and everything that had grown inside that room when it finally had enough space. She'd needed the locked room. She understood that clearly now. She'd needed the space where she was entirely herself, entirely in charge of her own work, and her own direction and her own name on the things she built. Not because Ji-hwan was monstrous, he wasn't monstrous. He was limited, the way everyone is limited, and his particular limitations had matched her particular vulnerabilities in ways that had taken years to fully reveal themselves. The locked room had saved her, and the things she'd built inside it had given her, when the moment came, the ability to walk out the front door with her bags and not look back. She got off at the West Village stop and walked the 2 blocks to the apartment and rode the elevator up and let herself in and stood in the small hallway for a moment. The apartment was dark, except for the light she'd left on over the kitchen counter, a habit she'd developed, leaving 1 light on, so she never came home to complete darkness. She'd started doing it without deciding to. It had just become something she did. She took off her coat, hung it by the door, set her bag down, went to the kitchen and poured water and drank it standing up, which was something Ji-hwan had always considered inelegant. He preferred things done in their proper place. Water at a table, meals at the table, everything in the right container at the right time. And she drank it standing at the counter, and it tasted fine. She thought about the protein interaction problem. Then she thought about the modified approach, the one that had been at the edge of her thinking all afternoon, the shape of it without the interior yet. She went to the desk and opened the laptop and pulled up the modeling software and sat down. She worked for another 2 hours. At 10:15, the solution came. Not with drama. It came the way solutions usually came to her quietly, from a slightly different angle than the one she'd been approaching from. And when she saw it, she understood immediately why she hadn't seen it earlier and why she would have seen it eventually, regardless. You couldn't force these things. You prepared the conditions, and you worked, and then you got out of the way. She documented it carefully. Every step, every assumption, the modification to the interaction model, the predicted outcome, and why it was predicted. She saved the file twice. Then she sent it to Nadine with a subject line that said simply, "You were right." She closed the laptop, sat back. The apartment was quiet around her. The street noise from below was minimal at this hour. The occasional car, the distant sound of the city, being the city, ambient and familiar. She thought about tomorrow. She would call Carla in the morning and confirm the full status of the meridian withdrawal. She would go to the lab and show Nadine the protein interaction solution. She would start drafting the framework for the Boston Amendment proposal because the stability data and the interaction solution together opened a commercial application pathway that hadn't been in the original agreement and needed to be. She would call her sister at some point this week. She'd been meaning to and hadn't, which was its own kind of information about how the past several weeks had consumed her. She would do all of those things. But first, she needed to acknowledge, in whatever private way she had for acknowledging things, that today had been a day she'd survived fully, and with all her faculties intact that had been designed, at least in part, to break her. Byun Ryong Young had looked at Imani's company and her patents and her carefully built independence, and had decided to go after the foundation of it. Ji-hwan's first instinct after she walked out had been to reach for leverage. The woman who had been cultivating Marcus for 2 months had been patient and deliberate and skilled in it. All of it had been aimed at exactly the right place. And it hadn't been enough. She got up and went to the window. Spipsint. The street below was quiet, the closing one of the workers inside flipping chairs onto tables with the practice efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, close together, talking, their breath visible in the cold air. She watched them until they turned the corner. Then she looked at the reflection of the apartment in the glass, the desk behind her, the lamp, the small shape of the room she'd made into something that worked. Tomorrow Carla would have the formal confirmation of the complete withdrawal. Tomorrow Nadine would see the protein interaction solution, and they would spend 3 hours taking it apart and rebuilding it with rigor, which was what you did with solutions that came to you at 10 at night. When you were running on no sleep and cold coffee, you tested them against people you trusted until you knew if they were real. Tomorrow the Boston brief would begin to take shape. Tomorrow all of it continued. The work and the building and the slow accumulation of something that was genuinely, structurally, legally and professionally, and in every way that could be measured hers. But tonight she stood at the window of the West Village apartment and let herself feel the full cost of the day. Not to punish herself with it, just to be accurate about it. It had cost something the phone call with Ji-hwan, the voicemail, the revelation about his mother, the server access entries, all of it. It had required something from her that she didn't have an easy word for. Not courage exactly, though there was some of that. Not strength exactly, though that too. Something more specific than either. The capacity to hold a very complicated situation with very complicated feelings underneath it and not let any of it compromise the clarity she needed to protect what mattered. She had held it. She was still holding it. The coffee shop worker finished with the last table and turned off the front lights, and the window went dark across the street. Imani turned away from the window. She went to the kitchen and made tea properly this time, not the cup she'd made earlier and forgotten, and she took it to the desk and sat down and opened the laptop one more time, not to work but to write. Kept a document. Not a diary, she'd never been a diary person, too much of a researcher to find the formless recording of feelings useful. More like a running technical log of her own thinking, notes to herself about the research direction and the business decisions. And occasionally, when it seemed important, the personal ones. She'd started it the same month. She'd started building the company, which probably meant something. She wrote 3 sentences. The first, the Meridian filing is being withdrawn, and the dismissal motion is on the record. The second, the protein interaction problem resolved tonight, modification to the binding site assumption. In layer 3, details in the modeling file. The third, I called Ji-hwan today, and I said what needed to be said, and I do not owe that conversation anything more than what I gave it. She read the 3 sentences. Then she closed the document and closed the laptop and drank her tea in the quiet apartment while the night settled around her, and she stayed at the desk until the tea was gone. And then she washed the cup and put it in the rack to dry and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The alarm was set for 6:30. She was asleep before midnight. And, in the morning, the work would be there, and the solution would hold up under scrutiny, and Carla would send the final confirmation. And Nadine would see the protein interaction modification and understand immediately what it meant for the next phase, and all of it would continue the long, difficult, necessary, entirely hers work of building something that had started in a locked room and was now too large and too real and too well documented to be taken from her by anyone who tried. All of it would continue. But first she slept. The alarm went off at 6:30 and she was already awake. Not from anxiety, that was the difference. And she noticed it the way you notice when a chronic pain has finally stopped. She'd been awake for 20 minutes before the alarm because her mind had already started working on the protein interaction solution, turning it over, checking the edges, looking for the place where it might fail. That was the good kind of wakefulness, the kind that meant something was alive and moving in the right direction. She turned off the alarm before it finished its first cycle, got up, made coffee properly this time, the pour over, the ground beans, the careful pour that Ji-hwan had once watched her do and called unnecessarily elaborate, and that she had continued to do every single morning for 4 years inside that townhouse without ever explaining why it mattered to her. It mattered because the process of it was meditative. The attention it required was small enough to be manageable and specific enough to be grounding, and at 6:30 in the morning, she needed something to bring her fully into the day, before the day brought itself to her. She drank the coffee at the desk, opened the laptop, pulled up the protein interaction modification she'd written last night, and read it the way you read your own work after sleeping, looking for the seams, the places where tiredness had allowed imprecision to pass as insight. She read it twice, it held. The logic was sound. The modification was real. She sent it to Nadine at 7 with a short message. "This is what I was circling yesterday. Tell me where it breaks." Nadine responded at 7:12. "Give me an hour." She showered, dressed, ate something actual food this time, eggs, because she could feel the accumulated deficit of the past several days and her body was asking for more than toast. She stood at the counter and ate the eggs and looked out the window at the street and thought about Byun Yong-young. She'd been thinking about the woman intermittently since Carla's revelation the day before. Not with anger, the anger would splitting. Briefly, the first sharp spike of it when she'd heard the name and understood the structure of what had been built against her. But it had moved through quickly. What remained was something more analytical. Byun Ryong-young had looked at Imani's company and her patents and the careful independence she'd constructed over 14 months and had seen correctly that these things were a threat. Not to Sirion Global, not to the syndicate's operations. A threat to Ji-hwan's ability to bring Imani back into his orbit, which was a threat to Byun Ryong-young's model of how her son's life should be structured. The woman had acted out of a kind of love, probably. A controlling, possessive, architecturally manipulative kind of love, but love nonetheless, the love of a woman who had watched her son build an empire and believed she understood what served him better than he did. Imani understood that impulse even as she refused to accommodate it. What she found interesting was what it revealed about Ji-hwan, that his mother had believed he needed help, that the natural authority and strategic capacity that Imani had spent 11 years inside the gravitational field of had not been, apparently, sufficient in Byun Ryong-young's estimation to handle the situation his wife's departure had created. She wondered if Ji-hwan knew what that meant about how his mother saw him. She suspected he did. She suspected that was part of what had made the phone call yesterday sound the way it sounded. At 8:30, Carla called. "The formal withdrawal is complete," and on the record, Carla said, "Preston has confirmed that the dismissal motion will be formally granted within 10 business days given the withdrawal. It's over on the legal side. The Boston agreement. Stable. I spoke with Harrington's office yesterday evening after I saw the withdrawal confirmation. They're satisfied with the resolution. The agreement stands as amended." Imani breathed out. A slow, complete breath, the kind you hold somewhere in your chest without realizing it for days, and only feel leaving when the reason for it is gone. "Good," she said. "There's one more thing." Carla's voice was careful in the way it got when she was about to say something she'd considered from multiple angles before saying. "Byun Ryong-young's attorney contacted me this morning. She wants to meet." Imani set down the coffee cup. "With me. With you personally. Not through counsel." The apartment was very quiet. "Why?" Imani said. The attorney didn't say directly. But the framing was. She described it as a matter of personal accountability. Her client's words. Imani thought about that. Personal accountability. From Byun Ryong-young, the woman who had spent 40 years being the most influential person in any room without ever making herself obvious about it. What Imani said. "She suggested this week. She's in New York. She came when the Meridian situation was building, and she's apparently still here. She's staying to see how it resolves. That would be my red, Carla said. Imani looked at the window. The street, the ordinary morning moving past. Set it up, she said. Day after tomorrow. Somewhere neutral, not her hotel, not my apartment, not your office. Find a restaurant. Somewhere quiet at lunch. Imani, you don't have to do this. I know I don't have to. Then why? Because I want to look at her, Imani said. I want to sit across from the woman who built that filing, and I want her to have to look at me while we talk. That matters to me, a pause. All right, Carla said. I'll arrange it. She spent the morning at the Brooklyn lab. Nadine had been there since before 8, and when Imani walked in, Nadine was at the whiteboard with a marker and the interaction modification written out in Nadine's handwriting, which was precise and slightly architectural. The handwriting of someone who thought spatially. Sit down, Nadine said. Imani sat. Nadine walked her through it. Every step. Every assumption. Every place where the modification required a leap, and every place where the leap was justified by the existing data, and every place where it was not yet justified and required additional verification. It took 40 minutes. When Nadine finished, she capped the marker and looked at Imani. It's real, she said. It needs verification on the binding site prediction. I want to run the confirmation assay before we treat it as settled. But the logic is sound, and the modification is original, and if the assay confirms, this changes the scope of the secondary application in a way that she stopped. Say it, Imani said, in a way that makes the secondary application potentially more significant than the primary. Nadine said it carefully, like she was checking the weight of each word before she set it down. I want to be precise. I'm not saying the primary patent becomes less valuable. I'm saying this opens a lane that the primary patent didn't open. Imani looked at the whiteboard. She thought about the locked study. The light green wood splitting. The light beneath the door at 2 in the morning. The old synthesis notes from 2011 that she'd been looking at when Ji-hwan was at a late meeting she hadn't been invited to join, which had happened so often by then that she'd stopped tracking the absence consciously and started using the evenings for her own work without planning to. She thought about the synthesis pathway she'd seen that night, the modification she'd recognized, the call to Nadine at 6 in the morning. She thought about all the locked doors between that night and this morning. Run the assay, she said. I want results by end of week. I'll start this afternoon. Nadine paused. You okay? I'm thinking about what it means. For the company? For everything, Imani said. She spent the rest of the morning on the Phase 3 institutional framework, the university partnerships that the clinical application pathway would require, the regulatory timeline, the funding structure for the external research she wanted to support alongside her own. This part of the work was different from bench work in ways she was still adjusting to. More people, more navigation, more attention to the human variables that didn't behave the way compounds behaved. But she was finding, as the months went on, that she was better at it than she'd expected. At 2 in the afternoon, she had a call with the department head at a university hospital in Philadelphia who was running a project that overlapped with the secondary compound application in ways that were interesting. His name was Dr. Yemi Adeyinka, and he was 44, recently tenured, careful with his words but not slow. The kind of researcher who had learned to be precise in meetings because he'd been in enough meetings where imprecision became expensive. They talked for an hour. By the end of the call, they had the outline of a collaboration agreement that would benefit both projects. Imani would present the secondary compound stability data to his team. His team's clinical protocols would inform her regulatory approach for the primary compound's application pathway. It was a good outcome. Clean and direct, two people who needed overlapping things from each other being honest about what those things were. She wrote up the call summary immediately after hanging up, while the details were sharp. This too was something. She'd learned not to let the documentation wait, because the confidence you feel in a meeting about remembering the important parts is almost always wrong, and the notes you wish you'd taken are always the ones from the meetings that went well. The meeting with Byun Ryong Young was at noon on Thursday. Carla had found a restaurant in Midtown Korean which was either Byun Ryong-young's request or Carla's read of what the woman would be comfortable in, and either way it was deliberate. Imani arrived 7 minutes before noon, which was her habit for meetings she needed to control the entrance of. She was shown to a private table in the back of the restaurant. Byun Ryong-young was already there. Imani had met the woman twice in 11 years of marriage. Both times at formal events, both times briefly. What she remembered, a woman of considerable self-possession, elegantly dressed without excess, who moved through social environments with the ease of someone who had stopped caring about approval decades ago and retained only the habits of grace. The woman at the table looked the same. 70 years old, white-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that was not cheap and not showy. Her hands were folded on the table. Her posture was exact. She watched Imani cross the room and sit down with an expression that Imani took a moment to read. Not hostility, not apology. Something she finally identified as assessment, the look of someone who is deciding in real time whether the person across from them is what they believed or something else. Dr. Whitfield, she said. Her English was accented but entirely precise. She had spent enough time in enough international rooms to have made the precision deliberate. Mrs. Byun, Imani said. A waiter appeared. They ordered tea without consulting each other about it, which struck Imani as its own kind of information. They had both made the same practical choice without needing to coordinate, which was either coincidence or said something about the kind of women they both were. When the waiter left, Byun Ryong-young looked at her directly. I will not waste your time with framing, she said. What I arranged through Meridian was wrong. Not legally wrong, only strategically and personally wrong. I am telling you this directly because you deserve to hear it directly. Imani looked at her. All right, she said. I acted on the belief that what you had built was a threat to my son's stability. That belief was not wrong. What was wrong was my conclusion that threatening your work was an appropriate response to it. She paused. I have spent 30 years believing that protecting Ji-hwan meant managing the variables in his environment. I applied that belief to you. That was a mistake. Imani folded her hands on the table, mirroring, without planning to, the older woman's posture. It was more than a mistake, Imani said. Yes, you targeted work that I built over 14 months. Work that had no connection to your son's business or his interests. You used access that came from a server intrusion to manufacture a legal claim. Yes, and if the lab notebooks hadn't existed, if Nadine and I hadn't maintained a parallel physical record from the beginning, which was not something anyone could have anticipated, that claim might have succeeded. Byun Ryong-young looked at her steadily. I know that. Does Ji-hwan know you're here? A pause. The first pause. No, Imani looked at her hands on the table, then back up. Why are you telling me this? She said. The filing is withdrawn. The legal action is over. You could have returned to Seoul, and this conversation would never have needed to happen. The older woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea, lifted the cup, set it down without drinking. I came to New York for the Meridian action, she said. I stayed to watch how you handled it. She met Imani's eyes. You handled it correctly, completely. You did not overreach and you did not collapse, and you did not make the mistake of letting the personal situation compromise the professional one. She paused. You handled it the way I would have handled it. The restaurant moved quietly around them. I am not saying this as a compliment, Byun Ryong-young continued. I am saying it as an explanation. I spent 11 years in the periphery of my son's marriage watching you make yourself smaller. I concluded that was who you were. I was wrong. She set her hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture, Imani thought. The deliberateness of a woman who had learned to use her hands to say things her voice was too controlled to say. That conclusion led me to underestimate you. And underestimating someone is never a neutral act. Causes damage. Imani looked at her. I underestimated myself for a long time too, she said. That also causes damage. Something shifted in Byun Ryong-young's face. Subtle. Not warmth, exactly, more like recognition. The specific recognition of a woman who had spent a lifetime in environments that required her to be less visible than she was, and understood exactly what that cost. They looked at each other across the table. I cannot give you back the time the Meridian action cost you, the older woman said, or the money. I am prepared to make a direct payment to your company equal to the legal costs you incurred responding to the filing. I don't want your money, Imani said. I know. I'm offering it anyway because it is the correct thing to do, and I do correct things when I have done wrong ones. You can refuse it, but I am offering it, Imani considered. Give it to the Pharmaceutical Research Foundation, she said. The one Ji-hwan made a donation to anonymously. Byun Ryong-young blinked. One blink controlled. He made a donation to that foundation? He did. A pause. Something moved across the older woman's face that Imani couldn't read precisely. It was too interior, too many layers deep. I didn't know that. He didn't tell you. No, she looked at the table. He didn't. She was quiet for a moment. He is trying to understand something. He does not know how to do that yet, but he is trying. I know, Imani said. Byun Ryong-young looked up. You are not angry with him. I'm accurate about him. Those aren't the same thing. The older woman was quiet for a long moment. He loved you, she said, in the limited way he knew how. I want you to know I believe that. I believe it too, Imani said. It just wasn't enough. And that's not a condemnation of him. It's just a fact. They finished their tea. The lunch was brief. Neither of them had ordered food, and neither of them suggested it. When Byun Ryong-young rose to leave, she extended her hand, and Imani shook it, and the handshake was firm and even and said everything that the conversation had moved toward without either of them having to name it directly. At the door of the restaurant, the older woman stopped and looked back. The work you've built, she said. It is significant. I know, Imani said. Good. A slight inclination of the head, not quite a bow, more like the gesture of one person acknowledging another's standing. Don't let anyone take it from you again. I won't, Imani said. Byun Ryong-young walked out. Imani stood at the table for a moment, in the quiet of the restaurant, the tea cooling, the lunch hour moving around her. Then she put on her coat and left. The confirmation assay results came in on Friday afternoon. Nadine called her while she was on the subway, back to Manhattan from the Brooklyn lab, which meant she got the call in the underground dead zone between two stops and heard the first three words Imani, the assay, and then nothing. The signal gone, and she sat in the moving train for 4 minutes holding the phone in her lap and not knowing, which was its own particular kind of tension. When the signal returned, she called Nadine back immediately. The assay confirms, Nadine said. The binding site modification holds. The secondary application pathway is real, and it's larger than the primary in scope. Imani, her voice was doing the thing again, the stripped-down thing, the thing underneath the professional precision. This is, you need to understand what this is. Tell me. The primary compound addresses a specific stability problem in a specific class of pharmaceutical applications. That's significant, that's commercially significant and scientifically solid, and we should all be proud of it. She paused. The secondary application with this modification addresses a mechanism that's been a barrier in 3 separate drug development programs that have been stalled for years. Not because the underlying science was wrong, because no one had solved the interaction problem. Imani sat in the subway car. The train moved through the tunnel. You solved it, Nadine said. Last Tuesday night. Alone. At 10 o'clock. After a day that would have broken most people. The data solved it, Imani said. I just stopped arguing with it. That's the same thing in your case. She closed her eyes for a moment. The train lurched slightly at a curve. Someone nearby was listening to music through earbuds, a bassist line barely audible, someone else's private sound leaking into the shared space. She thought about the synthesis notes from the Synthesis Notes 2011. The one she'd pulled up on a quiet evening while Ji-hwan was at a meeting she hadn't been invited to. She'd sketched and abandoned because the funding had dried up and life had moved, and she had moved with it, following someone else's architecture for 7 more years. Before the evening, she'd picked up those notes again with new eyes. 14 years between the sketch and the solution. Not wasted years. She understood that now. She'd needed the years of working inside Ji-hwan's world to understand what she was protecting and why. She'd needed the dinner She'd needed the locked room to build it. She'd needed to finally understand that the cost of staying was larger than the cost of leaving. She'd needed all of it, even the Meridian filing, even the server breach, even the 4 months of legal and professional crisis, to find out what she was made of when everything was on the line. She was made of this. Document everything this afternoon, she said. Every step of the confirmation. I want it in the notebooks by end of day. Already started, Nadine said. I'll be in the lab in 40 minutes. She was there in 35. They worked until 8. At some point during the afternoon, Simone's arrived. She'd been at a university library and had stopped by the lab on her way back to her apartment because, as she explained without apparent embarrassment, she couldn't stop thinking about the secondary compound data and needed to see the confirmation results in person. Imani watched her read through the assay documentation, watched her face as she understood what she was looking at. Oh, Simone said. Yeah, Nadine said from across the lab. Simone looked up at Imani. This is the interaction problem. The one that stalled the Barrett Labs program and the Okonkwo trial in Geneva. Yes, Imani said, you solved it. We have data that addresses it. We need peer review. We need the clinical application pathway. You solved it, Simone said again, not argumentatively, just firmly. The firmness of someone who was 26 and had not yet learned to preemptively minimize the things she understood clearly. I know what peer review requires. I know the pathway is long. But you solved the underlying problem. Those are both true at the same time. Imani looked at her. Yes, she said, they are. Simone nodded. Like that was settled. Then she pulled on a lab coat and picked up the notebook and said, what can I do? And they put her to work. At 8 o'clock, Imani sent everyone home. She stayed another 20 minutes alone in the lab, finishing the documentation, running the final check on the sample storage conditions, making sure the chain of custody on the confirmation assay was recorded correctly and completely. She locked the lab, walked to the subway. The night air was cold and clear, the kind of winter clarity that made everything sharp-edged and bright. She walked the 2 blocks to the station, with her hands in her pockets and her face into the wind. And she thought about the Barrett Lab stalled program and the Okonkwo trial in Geneva and the 2 other programs Nadine had mentioned, in passing the ones that had good underlying science and an interaction problem that nobody had solved. She would write to them next week, not to sell them something, to tell them what she'd found, to offer the data, to see what they'd been building that might now be able to continue. That was the part she hadn't fully imagined when she was working alone in the locked study. She'd imagined the company, the patents, the independence. She'd imagined building something that was entirely hers. She hadn't fully imagined what entirely hers might allow her to do for other people's, work for the researchers in underfunded labs, running good experiments that needed one more piece to move forward. She was imagining it now. The month of March came in cold, and then turned, mid-month, into something almost gentle. The city shed its winter coat in stages first, the willingness to be outside without bracing against it, then the return of light in the evenings, then the trees doing what trees did, cautiously and then all at once. Imani noticed it, the way she noticed things now, without urgency, without the half-attention of someone managing too many simultaneous performances. She noticed it because she was paying attention to her own life, which turned out to require considerably more energy than she'd spent on it during the years when she was managing someone else's. The Boston Amendment was signed in the 3rd week of March. The signing happened in New York this time. Harrington came to the city, which was its own statement, and they met at a conference room in Carla's office building rather than at Boston headquarters, which was also its own statement. The statement being that Imani Whitfield's company was no longer coming to the table as a smaller partner seeking terms, but as a party of equal standing whose work had just expanded in scope in ways the original agreement hadn't anticipated. Nadine was there. Carla was there. Preston was there, though he had nothing to litigate and attended as a form of institutional memory, and also, Imani suspected, because he wanted to see how this particular story ended. Harrington had brought his technical consultant again, the same one from the first Boston meeting, the one who'd asked 4 good questions and been surprised by the completeness of the answers. This time the consultant arrived with a copy of the secondary compound confirmation data that Imani had sent ahead, and he sat down across from her and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been reviewing data for days and has a lot of questions. They talked for 2 hours before the attorneys joined. The technical conversation was the best 2 hours Imani had spent in a conference room in years. He was genuinely good. He pushed on the right things. He found 2 places where the data needed supplemental documentation and was correct about both, which meant she left the meeting with 2 action items rather than a clean resolution, which was exactly the right outcome. The action items were real, and the fact that he'd found them meant the rest of the data was strong enough to withstand that level of scrutiny. The amended terms, when the attorneys finally came in, reflected a company whose secondary compound application had expanded the commercial scope of the original agreement by a factor that Harrington tried not to show on his face and didn't entirely succeed. She signed it at the end of the day. Carla walked her to the elevator afterward. "How are you actually doing?" Carla said. "Better than I've done in years." "That's what I thought." Carla pressed the elevator button. "I want to say something. Okay? When you first came to me, 2 years ago, you were very clear about what you wanted and very precise about the legal architecture, and I could see that you were good at this, at the thinking, at the strategy. But I remember thinking that you looked like someone who had been very careful for a very long time." She paused. "You don't look like that anymore." Imani looked at her. "No," she said. "I don't think I am." The elevator came. She got in. She rode down alone and walked out into the March afternoon. The light doing that particular late afternoon thing it did in New York in early spring, where it hit the buildings at an angle that made them look like they were made of something warmer than concrete and glass. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it be on her face. She called her sister from the street. Her sister picked up on the second ring. "Hey, how'd it go?" "It went," Imani said. "That bad?" "That good. I'll explain when I see you. I'm coming to Atlanta in 2 weeks." Her sister was quiet for a moment. "Then you sound different." "Different how?" "Like yourself. Like the version of you I've been waiting for." A pause. "Is that weird to say?" "No," Imani said. "It's accurate." She walked back to the West Village. 40 minutes, and she didn't take the subway because she wanted the walk, wanted the city around her as she moved through it, the noise of it, the density, the way New York in early spring felt like something resuming after a long pause. She stopped at a flower shop, 2 blocks from the apartment. She hadn't meant to. She'd walked past it dozens of times since moving to the West Village and had never stopped. But the display in the window was bright yellow and orange, some kind of ranunculus, mixed with something she didn't know the name of, and she stopped. During the years in the townhouse, flowers had appeared regularly throughout the rooms because they were part of the aesthetic Ji-hwan expected. A sound them from a florist who delivered on Thursdays and had standing instructions about what looked appropriate in which rooms. She had never thought of them as something she was choosing. They were part of the maintenance of a life that was being managed for specific purposes. She went inside. A woman at the counter looked up. "The orange ones," Imani said in the window. "Can I get a bunch of those?" "The ranunculus?" "Of course." The woman was already moving. "Anything else?" Imani looked at the display inside the shop. The colors, the specific brightness of cut flowers in a small space in March. "That one too," she said. "The yellow." She carried them home, took them upstairs, found a vase she'd bought at the street market in Chelsea, and filled it at the sink and arranged the flowers in it, which she did without particular skill but also without caring that she lacked at the skill, and set it on the windowsill next to the small succulent that had not died. She stood back and looked at it, orange and yellow against the window. The street below, the late afternoon light coming through. She'd bought them because she liked them. That was the whole reason. She made tea, sat at the desk, opened the laptop not to work, just to look at the secondary compound data. One more time the confirmation assay results, the numbers that said the thing was real. She looked at them for a few minutes. Then she closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet. She thought about the locked study. The light at 2 in the morning. The 14 months of building something in secret. inside a house where she'd been slowly disappearing. She thought about Byun Ryong Young's handshake, the exact firmness of it. She thought about Simone saying you solved it with the simple directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to talk around the truth. 7. She thought about Nadine in the lab at 7 in the morning with a marker on the whiteboard, running through the modification with the rigor that good science required and the care that long friendship added underneath it. She thought about Ji-hwan. She would think about Ji-hwan for a long time, not always, not with pain, but with the particular quality of attention you give to something that shaped you significantly. The way you think about a city you lived in for a decade, or a mentor whose limitations you eventually outgrew. He had been real to her. Parts of their life together had been real. The failure of it was real too, and the cost of the failure was real, and none of those things canceled each other out. She heard through Carla in the weeks that followed that he had left New York in January and had not come back. That Yeon Global's New York operations were being managed by the new COO, a man named Park from the actual shipping industry, who by all accounts was running things cleanly and with reasonable transparency. That Ji-hwan himself was between Seoul and Singapore, restructuring, pulling back from certain operations, which might mean what it seemed to mean or might mean something more calculated. She had no way to know and found, with some surprise, that she had made peace with not knowing. His story was his story. She had her own. The peer review process for the secondary compound application began in April. Imani submitted to 2 journals simultaneously, which was not standard practice, but was permissible, given the scope of the application and the novelty of the modification, and which she did after consulting with Preston about the intellectual property implications, and with Nadine about the scientific ones. The reviewers came back in stages. The first set of comments arrived in May, and they were rigorous, and she answered every one of them without defensiveness and with the precision the work deserved. And the answers were good because the work was good and the documentation was good, and the lab notebooks existed in exactly the form they needed to exist in. She hired 2 additional researchers in the spring. Both younger, both from underrepresented programs, both identified through the university network she was building, rather than through the standard channels that tended to reproduce the same demographics in the same positions. She interviewed them herself and made the decisions herself, and was honest with both of them about what the company was, and where it was going, and what she expected, which was high standards applied consistently, work documented correctly, and the willingness to say when something wasn't working, before it became expensive. One of them, a young man named Kofi from a university program in Baltimore, had the particular quality of scientific thinking that moved laterally. He made connections between disparate things that most people didn't see until he pointed them out. And then the connections seemed obvious, which was the signature of genuine insight rather than performed cleverness. He reminded her a little of herself, which she kept to herself for the first several months, because she'd learned from watching Simone that the young researchers who reminded you of yourself were the ones you had to be most careful about projecting onto. She let Kofi develop in his own direction. She made sure he had resources. She stayed out of his way. The summer came, and she barely noticed the transition, except that the light lasted longer, and the lab stayed warmer in the evenings, and the farmer's market on the corner of the street near the apartment was suddenly abundant in a way that made her stop there more often than she'd meant to. She cooked for herself, real meals, not just functional sustenance. She'd never been bad at cooking. She'd been good at it inside the marriage because it was part of what was expected, and she'd applied her characteristic precision to it, the short ribs and the good wine and the careful table. But she found that cooking for herself was different in a way she hadn't expected. She made things she liked. She made the same thing twice in a row, if she'd liked it the first time. She tried things that didn't work and threw them away without feeling like a failure, which was a relationship with food she hadn't had since her 20s when she'd still been entirely her own person. Small things. All the small things of a life that had been given back to her. In August, she received an email from the lead researcher at the Barrett Laboratory, the stalled program that Nadine had mentioned, whose interaction problem might be addressable with the secondary compound modification. His name was Dr. Anand Chaudhary, and he had been running his program for 6 years and had been stalled for the last 2, and he had read the preprint of the secondary compound and paper that she'd posted in anticipation of the peer review publication. And he had spent, he said, the better part of a week going through the data. He asked if she would be willing to talk. She called him the next morning. They talked for 3 hours. By the end, they had the outline of a research collaboration that would give his team access to the secondary compound modification data in exchange for clinical protocol development that her company's regulatory pathway needed. Splitting. It was the kind of arrangement that benefited both parties in ways that were complementary rather than competitive, which was the only kind of arrangement she was interested in building. At the end of the call, he said, "I have to ask, how long did it take you to develop the modification?" She thought about it. In continuous time, about 8 months from the initial insight to the confirmation assay. In total time, counting the original synthesis work I abandoned in 2011, about 14 years. A pause. "You went back to something you abandoned." "I had better eyes for it the second time." He laughed. "That's the best description of scientific maturity I've ever heard." She hung up and looked out the window of the apartment. The succulent was still on the windowsill. She'd added 2 more plants over the summer. She was, apparently, better at keeping plants alive than she'd believed. The vase that had held the orange and yellow ranunculus had held half a dozen different bouquets since March, each one bought because she liked it, no other reason. A sound like green of herself. She thought about the second version of self that had existed inside the townhouse, the one who'd locked a door and worked in secret and protected something precious by making it invisible. That version had saved her. She needed to be clear about that, needed to give it its due, because it was easy in retrospect to look at the secrecy and see only the concealment. But the locked room had been an act of self-preservation before it was an act of strategy. She'd needed somewhere to be entirely herself, and she'd found it in the most unlikely place, hidden inside a house that was slowly erasing her. She carried it out of that house. She was still carrying it not as secrecy anymore, not as something that needed to be protected by concealment, but as the core of a life that was fully visible and fully hers. The peer review publication came through in September. Both journals accepted, with minor revisions that she and Nadine addressed in a single working day, which was fast, which meant the revisions were genuinely minor, and the work itself was solid enough to stand almost exactly as submitted. The morning the publication went live, Imani was in the Brooklyn lab. Simone was at the bench running a protocol and saw the notification first and turned around and said, with characteristic directness, "It's published." Both of them. Imani looked up from the documentation she was writing. Both simultaneously. She closed the notebook, set down the pen, walked to the window of the lab that looked out over the harbor, and stood there for a moment. The water was that particular September, blue, deep, and clear, the sky above it doing something large and uncomplicated. A container ship was moving slowly across the middle distance, one of the enormous ones, the kind that moved so slowly you almost didn't register the movement until you looked away and looked back. She sounded like green wood splitting. She thought about sealable logistics and the shipping empire and the international docks from Busan to New York that had been part of the life she'd lived inside for 11 years and had never quite belonged to. She thought about a locked study and a light under the door at 2 in the morning and a compound that had been waiting 14 years for someone to see it correctly. She thought about a bathroom floor and a wooden spoon and a woman in a red dress and the way a hand had rested at a lower back for 4 seconds and broken something open that had needed breaking. She thought about what she'd said to Ji-hwan at that restaurant on 61st Street. "There isn't a version of this where I come back." She'd meant it when she said it. She meant it still. Not with bitterness and not with grief anymore, just with the clean accuracy of a fact that had been tested against everything she'd experienced since and had held up without difficulty. Behind her, Simone was telling Kofi about the publication, and Kofi was responding in the way he responded to good news, which was quietly and with consideration, as if he needed a moment to let it settle into what it actually meant. Nadine came in from the hallway, coffee in hand, already on her phone with someone. She looked at Imani at the window and held up the coffee cup in a small salute. Imani smiled. Then she turned back to the harbor and stayed at the window for another minute, just being where she was, in a lab she'd helped build, in a company she'd built. On the morning the work was published, and the world now knew what she'd spent 14 years getting right. She let it be enormous for exactly that 1 minute. Then she turned around. "We have the Barrett collaboration call at 2, she said to the room. "I know," Simone said, "and I want to go over the Phase 3 timeline before then. There are 2 gaps in the regulatory sequence that need to be addressed." "Already flagged them," Kofi said, without looking up from the bench. She looked at the 2 of them, the lab, the notebooks on the shelf, the confirmation assay data in the filing system, the published papers and the amended licensing agreement and the collaboration with Barrett and the university partnerships, and all of it, the whole architecture of something built from a single evening's worth of old synthesis notes. And 1 phone call to Nadine at 6 in the morning. She picked up her notebook, sat back down at the desk, and went back to work. The harbor outside was blue and large and indifferent and beautiful, and the lab was warm, and the data was real. And somewhere in the city, a woman named Imani Whitfield was sitting at a desk with a pen in her hand, and her name on 2 published papers and 3 patents and 1 international licensing agreement, and a growing company and a windowsill full of plants she'd kept alive, doing the work she had always been capable of doing, in the life she had built for herself out of the long, difficult, necessary process of becoming entirely free.